Before we get started, this video is sponsored by Fab Foundry, one of the first Flesh and Blood specialized game stores in the world, a pillar of the local Fab community in Portland, Oregon, a world tour organizer, and my personal favorite LGS. Fab Foundry is your one-stop shop for all things Fab related, whether that's singles, sealed product, playmats, sleeves, dice and tokens, especially featuring products from Metal Fab and Tie Cards. Fab Foundry also offers a rewards program which you can use to get store credit back on all your purchases. So please go check out Fab Foundries, support our local community in Portland, and use our promo code FleshandBad for a discount on your next singles order. On June 23rd, 2024, my girlfriend Tegan, our two friends, and I signed up for the Seattle Tacoma ProQuest Plus following the Battle Hardened the day prior. After Tegan had top 8 the Battle Hardened on Kano, we were excited to get some more games of Flesh and Blood in, have some fun, and finally head back home to Portland to see our two cats. Part the Misfail released 3 weeks prior, and I had picked up Zen Tamer Purpose, one of the 3 new heroes from the set. As a former Katsu player, I was initially drawn to Zen as a potentially weaker version of Katsu that focused on Tiger synergy as opposed to doing powerful combos with Bonds of Ancestry. When in practice with the deck, I quickly realized that this was not the case. The previous day, I scrubbed out, and Pankaj Bajwani, a Flesh and Blood household name, had taken down the Battle Hardened on Nu, one of the other heroes from Part the Misfail. I'd gotten a lot of good practice on Talishar over the previous weeks, focusing on playing into Nu, one of the more difficult matchups for Zen due to their heavy disruption, and I was determined to use this practice to try to get an edge in an otherwise unfavored matchup during the events. Somehow, during my Swiss for the ProQuest Plus, I managed to go 5-1, facing some Nus, Zens, and even Majin Bay on Kano, only losing a Zen Mirror to Brody Spurlock in the final round, which ended up putting me in second seed. In top 8, I played the Mirror, a Prism game, and finally reached the finals with Pankaj. Pankaj's new deck was a force to be reckoned with, presenting powerful disruption effects like Censor, Weakest Link, and Siren's Call, intended to be a hard counter for Zen. But I managed to pilot the deck to victory, some very suspect plays, and outvaluing Nu over the course of the game as opposed to setting up for a huge combo. And with that small ProQuest Plus victory, I had secured some of the earliest LL points in Zen's history. A history that I was now a part of, no matter how small. Now I want to attempt to not just share my own personal story with Zen, but attempt to paint a complete history of one of the most influential heroes in Flesh and Blood. A hero that was both beautifully intricate and flawed, a hero that was both loved and despised, and a hero that ended up rewriting the fundamental design of the game. Before I get too deep into this video, I wanted to add a disclaimer here. This video will attempt to paint as accurate a portrayal of Zen's history as I possibly can. However, much like any documentary, there will be inaccuracies, biases, and even things I unintentionally omit. There are dozens of community members we reach out to, and we would have liked to interview tons of people for this video, but unfortunately due to logistical reasons, we couldn't include everyone. While I've gotten a few peer reviewers to include their feedback to reduce this as much as possible, I will also ask you, the audience, to engage with this critically as well. If I make a mistake, forget something, misinterpret something, feel free to add it in the comments and we'll make our best to incorporate this in a separate video addendum. We want this to be as accurate as possible as part of Flesh and Blood's rich history, so we greatly value any feedback. Before we begin to talk about Zen, I think it would be helpful to give a brief overview of the pre-MST meta. The previous set was Heavy Hitters, a set centered around Brute, Warrior, and Guardian, leading to a very mid-range meta.
I'm Brian Gottlieb. I am a lead developer and senior game designer for Flesh and Blood. In terms of heavy hitters, I heard so much appreciation for the openness of the format. People really did feel like they could play pretty much any hero they wanted, and I think that was mostly meted out in the results. Certainly towards the end, as things always do, they got a little bit more tight and solved, but yeah, there was a lot of flexibility in terms of hero choice within the heavy hitters meta.
I am Eleanor Bird, basically Ellie Bird everywhere. I feel like it was kind of the one beautiful, pure, and perfect moment in like Fab's history that I can remember where Warrior was actually like a playable class, which was pretty cool. Seeing like Warrior not only like playable but like actually pretty good, I think like of the like top 5 decks, you could probably name at least like 2 to 3 Warriors depending on how you actually felt about Bolton.
While Heavy Hitters was a set designed to strengthen Brute, Warrior, and Guardian, many other classes found success in the metagame at this time.
Hey there, I am Taylor Crawford from the Card Guys. So we always had KO as a good hero in that meta. You also had Kano, which I remember whenever Kano did really well, everyone was like, oh, they just put in KO. But as later we found out at the Pro Tour, it was Kano that was doing well that meta. Dromai was also a pretty prevalent that meta. I remember every single illusionist, Prism had LL'd, so you had all the illusionists on Dromai. You also had people trying to play Viserai, trying to believe. Later did they know that was gonna be a show and a half later. But mainly, in my mind, it was always KO, Katsu, Dori, and Kasai were always the top 4 decks in some type of order. I know Katsu didn't do as well in big tournaments, but I always believed that he was a sleeping giant with bonds and stuff.
So I'm Pudding, and we are from Team Blue Pledge, and
I'm David Yao. I'm also from Team Blue Pitch. I just play whatever my teammates play. So yeah, I played ZEN as well.
I think Katsu is just fun to play because you are always interaction with your opponents. You can bluff people, and you got Astral Fool or Ancestral Empowerment thing to punish your opponent. I think it was like really a skill test to your opponent to how to block it correctly, and also from the side that who play Katsu, you always have to think about all the combo line you can play in your deck. So even with the same hand, you still got maybe 2 or 3 options to do, and I think it's the fun part to play multiple game with Katsu, and every time you play, you will find out something different.
Despite the praise for the openness of the Heavy Hitters metagame, there was some valid criticism from the community.
All the best decks were kind of the ones with like really, really sick numbers. I feel like you've probably heard that about the meta. There's a lot of like comments about like this metagame's all numbers soup.
Numbers are what matters.
Which is a little bit true. I think it was Yuki and I liked to affectionately refer to that metagame as wet noodle fab.
It never feels good to block a 2-power hatchet.
There was a fair amount of, at least latent dislike for the numbers focus of the game at that point in time.
That's why these players are drawn to this hero. The numbers are just extremely, extremely good.
Just getting your 1 to 2 points of value over your opponent every turn.
You are generating 1 value again and again with your Might token. Well, guess what? I'm doing that too. Just defensively on my Villain Dynamo, I am able to match your value.
Probably in no case more on display than something like Hatchet Story.
2-card 9 because you're refreshing your Dynamo. Yuck!
Some people just don't enjoy that mode of Flesh and Blood.
Another point of contention surrounded KO, the new brute hero from the set. KO was often seen by community members at the time as too pushed. His numbers were very good, and his hero ability turning blue 5 powers into 6 powers gave him added consistency. He allowed you to run previously less than amazing brute attacks, like Wild Rite and Pulping, attacks that had the ability to go wide but had a much higher deck building cost than the other brutes due to their ability to whip. KO making everything not on the chain a 6-power attack meant that these were much safer to include in your deck, and this meant his turn-to-turn damage was much better. This combined with a huge fridge which essentially added 10 to 11 block value, with added effects like making a might or intimidating on block, meant that KO was seen as a problematic hero at the time.
There are 2 types of metas you want to look at, which was pre-sash and post-sash. Pre-sash, I think, is one of the healthiest metas we've ever had. You had like Dori, Kasai. I mean, any deck really could make it. I mean, I've even seen a Teklo top 8 a ProQuest at that time. But then you get post-sash, which I think is one of the scariest cards ever printed. It did definitely narrow the field up a lot.
There was even speculation that he would LL before the end of 2024. Too fast, too tanky, too few drawbacks in his deck building. Remember that for later. While the perception of KO was that he was a really strong, dominant aggro deck, the reality was a bit different.
So I'm Daniel Rakowski. I'm a co-founder of the Runaways. If you don't know us, we are a competitive Flesh and Blood team. We do some content. We have a Discord and a weekly podcast. I think the funniest thing was just everyone thinking KO was still the best deck and like panicking that he got this armory deck. People like way overreacted. Like compared to like Lexi, or he was the most fair best deck.
Most of KO's LL points were from RTNs and PQs. He notably didn't convert that dominance into higher level event wins. I'm actually going to divert from the script a bit here and go on a brief tangent to back up this point with data. KO earned 557 LL points from the start to end of heavy hitters. Fortunately, LSS publishes data on RTN and PQ wins, and from there we can calculate exactly what percentage of his LL share was from PQs and RTNs, the more local level tournaments. During RTN season, KO achieved 35 wins, each worth 4 LL points, adding up to 170 points in total. During ProQuest season, KO achieved 79 wins. This is notably after the KO Armory deck was printed and after Dromai's ascension to Living Legend. ProQuests at this time were worth a bit less at 3 points, totaling to 237. 237 plus 170 is 407, and if we take 407 divided by the total number of LL points that KO achieved during heavy hitters, which is 557 points, we get that roughly 73% of KO's total LL points by the end of heavy hitters were from events lower than a ProQuest Plus. KO was a very good deck, he just wasn't as consistent as some of the other key players in the heavy season. Largely, the player base perceived him as one of the best decks, but the reality at the pro level proved to be slightly different.
We're down to 7.
Down to 7 plus the prognosticate.
1.
Just for 1, but that's... Yeah, oh!
And the snapback!
The snapback, yeah, because when you've played the non-attack
yeah,
action,
there you go.
It's
the Striders,
oh,
it's the Lesson in Lava, and there's the GG! Kano, Roman.
Destroying everybody on his path. Vincent was magnificent.
Heavy Hitters was a set where specialists could compensate for decks that weren't optimal or S tier with new tech and matchup knowledge, and I think that is ultimately why people look back so fondly on Heavy. There were decks with better numbers, or stats, or whatever, but it wasn't completely insurmountable.
It was just such a wide open meta. It was a fantastic time.
Heavy Hitters was a set that was praised for its open meta and criticized for its raw number focus, but now let's discuss Part the Misfail, a set that would completely turn that paradigm on its head.
I think you'd have a hard time finding two more fundamentally different sets than Heavy Hitters and Part the Misfail.
Yeah, I think MST, Part the Misfail, will probably be one of the most talked about sets and metas in Flesh and Blood's history going forward.
Regarding the MST meta, I thought was probably one of the scariest metas Fab has ever had.
You know, both had their share of fans and critics, which sort of speaks to the challenge inherent in game design. People want very, very different things.
Part the Misfail spoilers started on March 22nd, 2024, with a trailer featuring one new hero and 2 other heroes as well. Most people were really blown away by the artwork of the trailer, and the set's Japanese theme really resonated with a lot of players. Notably, one of Fab's fastest growing communities was in Japan, which is likely why this was the first set to be printed in Japanese. With the world premiere occurring in Tokyo and Worlds later scheduled to be hosted in Osaka, the set was really a love letter to Japan alongside the many other Asian cultures and belief systems that inspired some of Fab's iconic designs. The trailer and release page raised a lot of questions about the play mechanics of the set, and at the forefront of people's minds was a brand new mechanic, Chi, or as the release notes will later call it, Chi Points. Based on the trailer, no one knew what it was other than a cost for some very powerful hero abilities, but how easy or hard that cost would be to pay was anyone's guess. The only hint we had was an article that stated, Part the Misfail introduces Chi, a new type of resource unique to the Mystic talent. But discovery of one's inner Chi is a journey that takes time, for some a lifetime. Many journeys begin and few complete. For those who journey deep within themselves and reach the crossroads of harmony between mind, body, and soul, transcendence awaits. Community members had some wild speculations for what this ability would be. Was Chi a token? Was it part of the soul mechanic introduced in Monarch? Did the 3 blue pitch activation mean you just have to pitch a blue card to activate it? Would there be an equipment or a weapon slot that would generate the blue resource? There was a lot of debate about what this cryptic message from LSS actually meant. After a bit of time, we finally got some spoilers for another brand new mechanic, Transcend, which we would learn about a few days later with a new cycle of cards. There are 11 unique Transcend cards in total, each of them legendary blue instants. Each hero had access to 8 0-cost Transcend cards siloed to the Mystic talent, and 1 3-cost Sacred Art, which was unique to each hero. If you played a Transcend card after playing another blue card, you would physically flip that card over into an inner Chi and return it to hand, which you could then use for your hero ability, equipment, or just as a blue pitch for extra resources. The value of inner Chi was hard to determine at first. While we knew what the hero abilities were, there wasn't enough context to determine what else Chi would be useful for at this point in the spoiler season. The true power of transcending in Chi would not be fully understood until we got more card reveals. The equipment for Part the Misfail was really what gave us the payoff for transcending and using Chi. Mask of Recurring Nightmares stole the show as a better chord at peak, causing a bit of uproar within the community on the raw power of new in tandem with the recent reveal of Bonds of Agony the day before. The next day we got 12 Petal Kasaya, which gave Zen access to two powerful tools. The first being the ability to gain resources by transcending, and the second was the ability to make a on-demand Zen state, one of the most powerful tokens in the game. Then, on the 13th, Meridian Pathway was spoiled, a piece of footgear that gained Ward 3 on pitching a chi, and had the ability to play out auras as instants. Meridian Pathway saw it play on and off in Enigma, but ultimately was overshadowed a bit later on in Enigma's journey. All of these cards added context to the power of Chi and Transcending, but the most powerful equipment of all would be revealed on May 14th through what appeared to be a leak, Traverse the Universe. While unassuming for the first few days and weeks of spoiler season, Traverse would quickly gain notoriety as one of the most powerful cards in the game, breaking multiple formats and becoming widely regarded as one of the best headpieces ever. However, many people did not know how much Chi was worth at this time, so attention was diverted towards other headpieces. New had Mask of Recurring Nightmares, so she was excluded from running it. Zen had other headpieces like Mask of Momentum and Links, which people were theory crafting with. The obvious application that many people jumped to was this was an Enigma card, a powerful tool for sending out Mirror Guy for 8. At the end of the week, Part the Misfail was fully revealed at the world premiere in Tokyo, and with it, many began to form opinions on the power of the set and the power level of the new heroes. Community members began to speculate on the best hero in the set, and one hero seemed to be out of the running.
It wasn't Zen. Like, I don't know what the answer is, but people can rewrite history all they want. It was not Zen. I have plenty of receipts around people just absolutely dooming around Zen, being like, this hero's terrible. They printed counters to this hero right in the set. Why would they do this? LSS hates Ninja. They never want us to be top tier. I saw it all. And look, if it was easy to figure out, this game wouldn't be very fun. I think the mystery is part of what is supposed to come to the table with every set. So I'm not teasing anyone. I'm not trying to hold it over anyone's head. And obviously we got things wrong about this set. So that is the joy inherent in TCGs, is the journey of discovery and not knowing everything immediately. But the answer is definitely not Zen.
When it first released the text of Zen, we were in a Pro Tour venue. I forgot where we were. Perhaps it was in LA. I remember we had this conversation that, what do you think about the hero? At that time, we did not know that Taste the Tail was a thing, and we just look at all the cards that interacts with Crouching Tigers and think that like it is probably not that good, unless the chi is very like easy to have access to. So I think it ends up being a huge surprise that Zen would be that broken.
New and Enigma were the standout heroes of the set, presenting some of the most powerful disruption in the game and the ability to create giant, unmanageable board states of Ward, or some like to call them Ward states. It seemed like Katsu was just a better Zen because of the Bonds of Ancestry plus Art of War combo potential, in addition to his on-hits and aggression. When he compared Zen to KO, the premier aggro deck, it seemed laughable to believe that Zen's numbers even came close to a Blood Rush turn from KO. However, behind closed doors for pro players, the story was a bit different.
Finding Zen was really funny and interesting. I remember when Misfell first came out, right? Like everyone was saying this is just bad Katsu. I don't remember why exactly, because it seems so foolish now, but that's kind of what the sentiment was. And like we still thought KO was the best deck, so I was just jamming KO into like Enigma, like, oh my god, I don't know. I have to roll scabs to win. This is so bad.
So I started playing. So I really started liking Zen whenever I saw that he could play Bonds of Ancestry with his hero power by tutoring it. I just came off playing Katsu, and Bonds of Ancestry is a drug. Playing a 0 for 7, 0 for, and if you want to start thinking of terms like that, you can extend turns with it. It could be a turn ender with Flusterfist and stuff like that. So whenever I saw that he could tutor them by playing the blue cards in my deck, so giving value to blue cards, I knew it was definitely the hero for me for that meta.
We might never be able to get a full picture of what happened behind the scenes, but we were able to get a few early showcases. One of the most notable videos to me is the show match between two prominent pro teams, Blue Pitch and the Card Guys.
Even though if we are not the first one to publish the list, we would be the first one to show off Zen's potential in the the card guys show match.
The two Zen pilots for these games were Pudding Tom and Nathan Crawford, but this match also featured another player who would later become known for Zen, Nova Chan, winner of the battle-hardened Kuala Lumpur. Pudding's list from this show match was very unique, opting for a mix of Tiger synergies with a relatively light Bria Bonds of Ancestry package.
The list that I play on show match is, I would say it's 95% the same that I testing. Because in Hong Kong we are the last week to play a national, so I just think it's fine to just play what I discover. And I think that will be other people that find out that Bond Zen is broken. So I just try to show that this Zen that can do a lot of crazy stuff, and let's see that other people that get the list better, so I can play a better list in my national.
This would become very similar to later Zen lists down the line, where the focus was less on Bonds of Ancestry and more on consistent damage. One notable observation of this list was that this was much lower on blues than later Zen lists. My guess is that the idea here is to make a deck similar to 5 with a much more redline focus and saving transcendence for the right opportunity. Nathan's list from the card guys went in a completely different direction, opting for a much bigger focus on Tiger Anthem effects. Nathan was running Roar of the Tiger and Headley's Tail, cards that could have huge upsides in the right circumstances, but heavily relied on keeping multiple cards in hand, leading to them falling out of favor as the metagame became more refined. Nathan did have some very spicy cards that would eventually go on to see play. Shifting Winds of the Mystic Beast made an appearance in later Bonds of Ancestry lists, and Tiger Eye Reflex would be an interesting sidebar option during later periods of Zen's history. However, one of the most prophetic Zen lists came from a notable voice in the community, Tog from We Make Best.
But we were going to go another Tiger into another Bonds. Bonds vanish 100 wins. 100 wins into Chase the Tail at the end, which is just another 30 damage turn thanks to Shift Bonds. Bro, I'm playing Yu-Gi-Oh at this point. Bonds Zen is literally just playing Yu-Gi-Oh.
Tog went into a much more unfair direction, opting for 9 copies of Bonds of Ancestry, 9 copies of Descending Gustwave, and 0 Surging Strikes. While the list had some suspect cards, prismatically aligned Yellow 100 Winds and Red Be Like Water, the list was otherwise incredibly deadly, and would later be inspirational for many of the meta-defining Bonds Zen lists over the coming months.
And then we finish off with a Fluster for 7, putting them down to 11 through their whole hand blocked. And so that was a 42 damage turn all up on turn 2.
Some community members dismissed this as a once-in-a-blue moon high roll, however this game state would not be unheard of in the following months.
He got a turn for like 35 damage and you have no way to come back, even if you got all the disruption and stuff. It only took 1 turn to make Zen to win the game.
In my hometown in Dallas, we actually had like the first rated event of the Mistvale season. We had a double PQ Plus, the release weekend attached to DreamHack Dallas, and I just like took Zen because Yuki convinced me that the deck was insane. The thing that was like stood out to me as like the most absurd thing possible was in the top cut. I was playing against a KO, and the judge was somebody I knew, and he pulls me aside and he asked me this very funny question where he's like, "Hey Ellie, can you tell me which pieces of Null Rune are in your deck box?" And I was like, "Gloves and boots, right?" And he was like, "That's the problem." And he like shows me my deck list and gives me an IP1 or IP2 against this KO, and I'm like, I guess I'll go lose. And then I just like killed my opponent during the IP2. Because I just like played Ancestral Harmony and flipped to Chase the Tail, and then just like transcended, floated 1 Art of War, and sent like 45 damage at this KO who flashbagged me and just like hit an extraneous Tiger, and I was just like, oh, this guy's fucked up.
Lucas Oswald and Shane Martin on our team built like an early Tiger focused Zen deck that was pretty good. I played into it a lot. They beat me fairly often. It just felt like an Art of War dependent deck. So I kind of didn't play it yet. And then Lucas watched the We Make Best video, and we just made a simple list that put 9 copies of Bonds of Ancestry in, and I tried it for literally 2 games, and then I said, this might be the best deck ever printed, and it's going to warp the entire format. And then, of course, I played it because I like playing broken decks.
While Part the Misfale was a set that was mechanically unique and beautifully designed, the set would later become infamous for one key flaw: power. We'll never be able to get a full picture of the development process behind the scenes, but based on what we know from interviews, this set did face issues with balancing Zen, especially with regards to Classic Constructed and Blitz. Brian Gottlieb, in an article we'll touch on later, mentioned that Zen was the last hero to be finished during set development. Zen had gone through a few iterations, even one as Benji, before becoming a different hero entirely.
I have talked in the past about how this was originally intended to be adult Benji, but there were a few reasons why it didn't become adult Benji. A lot of people say it's related to Benji's specialization, spring tidings. Maybe even I've said that. That was part of it. But also Creative was not entirely comfortable with having Benji appear in the context of Part the Mistveil. They have other visions around Benji, apparently.
The reality was a bit different and speaks to the difficulty in balancing a hero designed to create raw materials like hand tigers. I had personally speculated that Zen's time as Benji led to him breaking and doing the 400 damage turns mentioned in the article, utilizing card draw effects like Spring Tidings and Art of War.
Yeah, this was after he stopped being Benji. Nothing related to Spring Tidings. A lot of it was Tiger creation in hand and conversion through Potion of Luck into just more real cards, and then usually closing with things like Tiger Swipe and just absurd numbers on the tail end. So it was almost always rooted in Tigers, to the point where when Part the Mistveil wrapped, I was basically like, please no more Tigers for a very long time, because we couldn't find safe Tiger cards anymore. If you made another Anthem, they became too good. If you put Tigers in hand, it became too good. We were kind of at the end, we felt, of the Mystic Tiger in hand development space. I have since softened my position there. I do think there is more space to explore. But in that moment of just, 3 to 4 intense months of focus, it felt like we were reaching the end of our rope with Tigers in the Mystic class.
Zen, unfortunately, was a very difficult hero to balance, and ultimately the cause of this issue is simply testing limitations within the dev team. No matter how many people LSS hires, there's a fundamental reason why constructed formats are often much harder to balance than limited. LSS devs are some of the best game designers in the world, but my speculation is they encounter two main issues. First, the amount of testing they are able to do pales in comparison to the number of games that players and pro teams can pump out.
We do a lot of drafts. Like, we do the number of drafts on par with, I would say, most Pro Tour competitors in development, usually in the range of 100 plus drafts of a set. And we usually get pretty deep into the mines at that point, and we're through most of the archetypes. I can even think of, sets where I think we found more archetypes than the public, and it is rare for that to happen. It basically doesn't happen in CC at this point. The public just plays so many more games of CC.
This is a problem that I think is not LSS's fault. Internal decklists for Zen, especially with Bonds of Ancestry, is simply not as refined and potent as what members of the Fab community were able to create. And by the tail end of MST development, it seemed like the Zen decklist internally had dropped Bonds of Ancestry entirely.
The biggest difference was always just how focused we were on Bonds. Our decks just weren't good enough, flat out, and that became clear very quickly when the real-world Bonds decks came to prominence.
And the second problem stems from the MST triangle. The MST triangle is a community term for the balance between Enigma, Nu, and Zen within the set of MST. This triangle is basically a rock, paper, scissors of game balance between the heroes. Zen would basically use his aggression and breakpoints to counter Enigma's ward, Enigma would use her ward to counter Nu's low damage output, and Nu would use her overwhelming disruption to strip cards out of Zen's hand. Now, I wanted to mention that this construct was not entirely accurate on release for reasons we'll touch on later, but I do think it does represent LSS's internal testing and perceptions.
I think that, look, the ZEN situation was outside the scope of what we expected, and you've spoken to this a little bit before. A little bit of that has to do with the sequencing that things came through dev, where Nu was well refined internally, and as we saw in the real world, Nu was very good at keeping ZEN in check, and so a lot of our internal data was, I think, shaped around this impression that ZEN was okay because it's like Nu was the natural predator, and all was good.
From what we can gather, Nu internally seemed to do very well against Zen, which may have contributed to why his raw power was overlooked. After reviewing a bunch of the early discussion around Zen card design, it's almost comical to look back at early opinions on Zen's perceived strength as being a somewhat mid-hero, but I also missed this initially. I was very much a person who thought Zen was a worse Katsu, which is honestly why I was drawn to the hero in the first place. It was an oversight among casuals and pros alike. When looking at Zen on paper, it seemed implausible that his mid-range game plan could compete with KO, and it seemed unlikely that his combo or aggro package could compete with Katsu. But as the community and I played more with Zen and refined strategies and builds, it became obvious that this hero would fundamentally break the game. Now that we've touched on some of the struggles with Zen's design internally, for the next part of this discussion, I want to highlight some of the things that community members initially missed when Zen was spoiled that led to a fairly lukewarm reception from the player base.
I don't think that I'm alone in thinking that maybe Ninja sort of got the least amount of help this set.
I don't think he's going to be nearly as good as New or Enigma from a sheer competitive objective perspective. What does Zen do powerful-wise that Katsu and Phi cannot do in their own way?
This section is going to be a fairly deep dive into Zen's famed cards and deck composition for people who've never played the hero or players who only have a vague recollection. The first and most important card I want to touch on here is Bonds of Ancestry. Bonds of Ancestry, or Bonds, was a card that was initially printed in Outsiders to buff Katsu's predictable combat math and add flexibility to his lines. Bonds is functionally a 0-for-4 with Go Again that could banish a card from your graveyard and then search for a card with the same name for your deck, which you can then play this combat chain. It was released alongside a very flexible combo card, Descendant Gustwave, or Descendant, an unassuming 1-for-3 that was discounted by 1 and got 2 additional power as Surging Strike was the last card played. An important thing to note here is that Descendant could also be used as a starter, or a card with unconditional Go Again that can start a combo line much like Surging Strike. I wanted to give 2 examples here of how these cards were played. The common line for Katsu was like Kadachi into Surging Strike, Descendant Gustwave, Bonds of Ancestry, banishing maybe a Dishonor from graveyard into Dishonor, which is basically Katsu's bread and butter line. This ended up being a 4-card 19 with a pretty devastating on-hit on the back end. To illustrate that Descendant can also be a starter, you could do something like Kadachi, Descendant, Bonds, Flusterfist, which ended up being a 3-card 13 with some pretty annoying breakpoints. An important thing to note here is that Bonds of Ancestry can also recur another copy of Bonds of Ancestry or Descendant Gustwave. This interaction could allow for some very wide combat chains such as Descendant, Bonds, Flusterfist. Notably, early Zen lists did experiment with Bonds of Ancestry. However, the biggest miss was that people were including Surging Strike alongside Bonds of Ancestry, which was good in Katsu, but many didn't realize you could just play Descendant by itself as a starter, even if it was below rate on its own.
We had some Bonds lists, they were not good enough, and we basically moved away from Bonds lists, and we're focused more on, I guess, what Zen became in the end. Like, that is the best example of what internal Zen decks look like. And it was a fine deck, and it was a deck we were happy with and did cool stuff and was a positive contributor to the metagame. Like, all these mistakes feel silly in retrospect. That's the hard part about it. Just never came to where we had the fully fleshed out Bonds line.
Another key miss with early Zen experimentation was what headpiece they were using. The 2 equipments many gravitated towards were Mask of Momentum and Mask of the Pouncing Lynx.
I think I'd rather have Lynx or Momentum, where Momentum will get me some value over the game, maybe forcing awkward blocks, and then Lynx will help me like just have my big pop-up turn and then maybe end with Assault that's worse.
A notable downside to both headpieces is that if you need a block with them, you end up losing access to their abilities. With the Momentum, you would no longer be able to threaten card draw, and with Lynx, you would no longer be able to tutor a card. Traverse the Universe, on the other hand, allowed you to block 2 and get the effect of tutoring a chi.
Once we had Traverse, which was admittedly fairly late in the development process, it was just Traverse at that point.
Unlike Mask of Momentum and Lynx, you actively wanted to block with Traverse. The effect of Traverse basically said, block 2 and tutor one of the strongest cards in your deck. That's also blue in case you need the extra resources.
It blocks for 2, whereas Master of the Pouncing Lynx, it breaks itself and then it doesn't block for 2. So it's automatically, like 2 points of block is worth at least 3 points of life, right? Just in terms of like blocking on hits. So like you're getting like 2 to 3 value out of the block, and then you're fetching a combo card, and then you're getting a Crouching Tiger. This thing crazy for Zen. I think you have to run this if you're playing Zen.
The biggest reason why it was glanced over is because people are unsure how often you could get Transcend cards in a deck, and we'll touch on this a little bit later. Another deck building pitfall players fell into was being distracted by many of the previously printed Tiger cards. Most people who were drawn to Zen were too focused on cards like Roar of the Tiger, Head Leads Tail, Predatory Streak, and others. In fact, based on what we know of the design of Zen, many of these Tiger Anthem effects, or Go Wide Tiger cards, ended up being intentionally designed around so that they wouldn't break Zen.
There came a point at the tail end of development where I just was convinced that we couldn't make another Anthem effect for Tigers. It was a wall. It was a wall we were running into over and over, and it was a wall we were running into late into development. And when you get late into development and you're having these recurring problems, it gets really scary because you're asking yourself, can we actually put out a balanced tier?
One of Zen's biggest strengths was having access to 7 armor. This gave him the ability to block most disruption in Flesh and Blood by throwing all of his armor in front of an attack, since most disruption in Fab caps at around 6 power. Additionally, the breakpoints on armor allowed him to be very flexible with blocking. For example, Zen could block with a 3-block traverse and strides, allowing you to keep a 5-card hand with Arsenal, maintaining access to the value that Kasaya and Shuko provided over the course of the game. One last reason why people initially doomed on Zen were the counters to Zen printed in MST. At generic, there are 2 main counter cards. Weakest Link was a generic 2-for-6 attack that, on hit, discarded no block from hand. Mainly this could be used against Chi, but also applied to Crouching Tigers and Art of War as well. Stonewall Gauntlet was another generic equipment printed in MST to target Zen, mainly designed to counter Art of War turns from ninjas or decks that just couldn't close the combat chain very easily. Zen could notably play around this effect, but it often functioned as a 6 or 7 block against him due to Bonds of Ancestry requiring that the combat chain remains open. New was also the main counter to Zen printed in the set. New's advantage in the Zen matchup was their ability to strip cards out of Zen's hand and arsenal. Importantly, it was not really any one specific card that countered Zen, but rather the density of disruption that made the matchup slightly favored for New. New's goal was basically to disrupt Zen every turn and keep him off of the 7-card hand. However, if New ever whiffed on disruption or drew a brick hand that couldn't deal with 7 armor, she could often lose on the spot. Before we examine any lists or get into his history, I want to establish some context for this video by taking a look at Zen's card pool. I will attempt to break this into logical groupings, which will help us discuss this later, but this is largely going to be from the perspective of Classic Constructed. However, anything I say here probably applies tenfold to Blitz. Zen's hero text is relatively innocuous at first glance, but it ends up raising a lot of questions. How good is tutoring for a combo card? How good is making a Crouching Tiger hand? How hard is it to activate? When compared to Katsu, you basically had to jump through a bunch of hoops to get roughly the same tutor effect, plus an additional Crouching Tiger, which seemed like a significant increase in cost for a very minor benefit. This also might be a good time to touch on the value of Crouching Tigers, and a common question that players had is, what is a Crouching Tiger worth? In my estimation, it could be anywhere from 1 to 2 damage, maybe an action point, or you could also use it as a material, or a card that is used to pay for the cost of other cards.
Hand tigers are so hard. It's just a raw material thing. Like, there are multiple ways, like aforementioned Potion of Luck, to convert raw materials, but another massive one was Art of War. That is just this thing that turns a tiger into something very real over and over.
We'll try to use the rest of Zen's kit to put this hero ability into context a bit later, but the effect is surprisingly very powerful. Let's start by going over Zen's equipment suite. We've already talked about Traverse the Universe extensively, but this ended up being the strongest Zen headpiece used in most competitive deck lists. The next card I want to touch on is 12-Petal Kasaya, which was a very versatile piece of equipment. You could use it to gain resources when transcending in the early game, and you could also use it to block or make a Zen state in the late game. For some matchups, making a Zen state token was game-changing, especially into Runeblades, go-wide decks, or any deck with breakpoints. Zen state ended up being one of the most broken tokens in all of Fab, staying around for 2 turns. It could easily represent 10 plus damage blocked against some decks, and was an important tool to shift tempo in Zen's favor. The primary arm piece for Zen was Tiger Stripe Shuko. Shuko allowed you to buff Crouching Tigers and any small attacks, and send annoying breakpoints that made it very hard for opponents to block. It was generally one of the last equipments you wanted to block with if you could help it, due to its continuous buff effect. In some matchups, it could easily add up to 10 plus damage over the course of a game. Strides Reprisal was the last main piece of equipment for Zen, most often utilized with Art of War. It synergized with Traverse to block 3 in total and grab a Chi plus Tiger to form the 7-card Zen hand. Lastly, I want to touch on some other pieces of Zen equipment that did see play. First, let's talk about Pouncing Paws, which became Zen's main foot slot later, but it did see some niche use cases early on against Dio for the Battle Claws. In general, most Zen lists had some amount of AB in the sideboard for Wizards and Runeblades. The most common configurations ranged anywhere from 0 AB to AB3 Spellvoid 1, depending on the prevalence of Wizard in the meta. Lastly, Time Skippers was an important sideboard piece that occasionally saw play when Prism was at her peak, allowing Zen to break ALS and other auras with Spectra. Next, let's move on to the weapons. Zen builds early on had 3 main weapons. The first was Tiger Teaming Kakara, which was Zen's signature weapon. It represented really good breakpoints of 2 on the weapon, plus 1 if you had a Crouching Tiger. Kakara was mainly used for slower or kind of more mid-range matchups. Next, Zen had access to Zephyr Needles, and for the most part, Needles were used into very aggro matchups, especially in earlier Zen lists. Your opponent basically had a choice, either block 3 on the Zephyr Needle and break it, or take 2 and it stayed around for future turns. Zen used Needles to pressure cards from hand and get efficient damage with Go Again. The final weapon I want to mention here is Talishar, which saw play in very early Zen lists. The idea with Talishar is that if all your attacks have Go Again, sending 2 to 4 damage is very good, and the rest counters wouldn't matter with how quick games went. Talishar did have some trade-offs though. Notably, since it was a chain ender, it anti-synergized with other chain enders such as Mauling Key, CNC, and other disruptive effects. Personally, I wasn't the biggest fan, but I did see a lot of good success. Let's now transition into ZEN deck composition, and for this section I've broken ZEN's card pool into 5 distinct categories: core cards, card advantage, filler reds, filler blues, and sideboard cards. We'll expand upon what each of these means as we go into each section. First, let's discuss the core ZEN cards, or the cards that were auto-includes in 99% of ZEN decks. The most obvious category here is the Transcend cards, and ZEN is a bit unique from the other MST heroes in that you need to run all 9 Transcend cards because of aggro matchups. The slower you are to Transcend, the more likely you are to lose. This is also why filtering, or getting cards out of your hand to draw deeper into your deck, was a very important skill in ZEN. The faster you were able to see your Transcend cards, the better off you were. Transcend cards were flexible, either representing a blue, a tutor off ZEN, and sometimes even a ZEN state token. However, a common question that people initially had when trying to evaluate ZEN is how likely are you to Transcend? The math actually works out pretty easily here. Using the assumption that all 9 Transcend cards are present in the deck, we can use a hypergeometric calculator to calculate the probability to see at least 1 Transcend card. In the first hand drawn, or the top 4 cards of our deck, we have roughly a 48.8% chance to see at least 1. In the top 8 cards, those odds improve to 75.1%. In the top 12, you have roughly a 88.7% chance, and in the top 16, or the first 4 hands, the odds are roughly 95% in your favor. I wanted to add a note here that this is not how likely you are to Transcend, but rather to just see 1 Transcend card. The actual percentage of how likely you are to Transcend within the first 4 turns of the game is probably slightly lower, but probably within a negligible less than 1% difference. The cool part about Transcend cards is that they go back into the deck after you use them and can be redrawn into later. Shuffling from effects like your hero ability helps cards on the bottom get mixed back in so you're more likely to draw Inner Chi, which you don't have to pay the cost of Transcending to use. In general, a pre-flipped Inner Chi is better value than Transcending to make an Inner Chi. And my final note here is that Transcend cards were blue instants with a minor utility, which sometimes led to many cool interactions. Here are a few of my favorite interactions with Transcend cards. Because they were instants, if you put a Wind Chakra on the sack and played a Transcend card in response, the Wind Chakra will end up getting the buff and the Transcend card will flip because they both see a blue card has been played before resolving. One of the most powerful combos with many of the Mystic heroes was double Transcending to deny the effect of a CNC. So if your opponent sent a CNC at you and you have an Arsenal, you could basically use a Transcend card from Arsenal and a Transcend card from hand to get around the effect of your Arsenal getting destroyed, because if you play them both on your opponent's turn, they'll both return to your hand. Another one of my favorite interactions in Part the Misfail was Preserved Tradition and Passover. These cards could function as pseudo counterspells for other Mystic heroes. For example, if your opponent played Passover on an attack in your graveyard and you Preserved Traditioned it in response, your opponent's Passover would not resolve as there's no longer a legal target, and they would not get a Chi back to hand. Some Transcend cards could have a drawback. For example, Drop in the Ocean could reduce the power of your own attack, Preserved Tradition could put a card that you don't want back in the deck, and Path Well Traveled could give your opponent an action point, which could end up being pretty devastating. The next couple cards I want to talk about were the combo cards. The first being Tiger Swipe, which was a 1-card 5 with a Tiger and a Shuko trigger, and sometimes the on-hit for Tiger Swipe was quite relevant, threatening additional Tigers on Art of War or Sacred Art turns. The next 2 core cards I want to touch on here are Chase the Tail and Aspect of Tiger Body. I wanted to add a note here that in many early ZEN lists, Chase the Tail was a bit less popular, specifically for its clunkiness with Bonds of Ancestry, but Aspect of Tiger Body was pretty much ubiquitous across the lists. Chase Aspect a bit later on became ZEN's bread and butter combo, outputting some of ZEN's most efficient damage. I'll now attempt to walk through the classic Chase Aspect combo. This combo basically requires you to have 3 cards in hand: a blue Transcend starter, a Transcend card, and either Chase or Aspect. Notably, the blue Transcend starter could be anything. It could be a blue attack action with Go Again, it could be a blue non-attack with Go Again, or it could be another Transcend card in and of itself. The combo starts by playing the blue Transcend starter and then playing your Transcend card, which then nets you a resource from 12-Petal Kasaya, which is very important for paying for this combo. You can then use the Chi to activate ZEN's ability, to tutor for the other half of the combo depending on the card in hand. So if you have Chase the Tail in hand, you get Aspect of Tiger Body off ZEN, and if you have an Aspect of Tiger Body, you can get Chase the Tail. Finally, after playing your Transcend starter, you can play a Tiger, play Chase the Tail, play Aspect of Tiger Body, and then you can use the Tiger that Aspect of Tiger Body creates to get the additional buff off of Chase the Tail. In an ideal scenario, this combo would range anywhere from a 3-card 12 to a 3-card 15, depending on the combo starter used. With a pre-flip chi, this combo actually potentially gets even a little bit better. Specifically with a chi in hand, a random blue, and a chase aspect in hand, you can pitch a blue to Kakara, activate Zen to get the other half of the combo, play the tiger you get from Zen, chase the tail, aspect a tiger body, and then finish on a tiger, and this could represent a 3-card 14. There are 2 final staple cards I'll touch on here. 100 Winds Red and Blue are combo cards with Go Again and a minor upside if you played multiples in a row. And lastly, Command Conquer was a staple for most decks in Classic Constructed, a powerful tool against decks running D-Reacts, Rangers, and decks that just couldn't block well in general. For this next category, I want to talk about card advantage, and I think card advantage is a pretty nebulous term, but I will loosely define it here as any card that when played nets you additional cards or lets you see more cards than your opponent. The most common example of card advantage at the time was Art of War, which was one of the more prevalent card advantage engines in Fab as a whole, used in decks like Katsu, Phi, Levaya, and others. There are 4 modes to Art of War, the 2 most common being +1 to all attack actions and banishing attack from hand to draw 2 new cards. The other mode of giving your next attack action Go Again was sometimes used in different decks, depending on how many action points they were able to use. And finally, the last mode on Art of War was defending with a card from Arsenal, which is often seen as the desperation mode, or the mode you were about to use when you were going to die. At the time, typically the most common way you turned Art of War into card advantage is with Bindal Spring Tunic. Art of War then basically comes a 0 cost, replace itself and another card with the +1 Anthem effect, and draw 2 new cards. The card draw mode on Art of War synergized especially well with Hand Tigers, specifically from Zen's hero ability or from Strides of Reprisal. With Zen, the most common use case for this card was to block with Traverse and Strides to get the 7-card hand, pitch a blue to Art of War banishing a Crouching Tiger, draw 2 new additional cards, and get +1 on all attacks. At this point, you now have a 6-card hand, 2 resources floating, and the +1 buff effect. And then after this, you can use the chi that you got to search for any card in your deck to help smooth out your draw. The second 2 cards that fall into this category are Descending Gust Wave and Bonds of Ancestry, that we've talked about at length already. However, these 2 cards arguably represent card advantage, as you're using 2 cards and another card in pitch to effectively get a 3rd card of value from your graveyard or deck, with 2 resources floating. The 3rd card advantage tool I want to touch on was actually a bit controversial. Orihona Mystic Tenants was one of the ultimate high roll cards. The best case scenario for this card is that you double transcend, netting resources from Kasaya, and then use those extra resources plus a chi to pitch to Orihona, effectively turning 2 cards into 3 additional cards. Double transcending also guarantees you that you have a second chi in hand to activate Zen after casting Orihona to help smooth out your draw. You could also notably only use 1 transcend card plus a blue, net the resources from Kasaya, and draw 3 cards. However, this presents a risk that you may not be able to draw into another chi card, making your turn potentially a little bit more awkward. The worst case scenario for this card was that it sometimes was a blue no block that didn't easily enable your transcend cards, sometimes leaving you a bit stranded in the early game. Many Zen lists ran this card for the insane high roll potential it represented. However, other lists shied away from this card for more consistent play patterns. The 4th card that provided card advantage in Zen was Levels of Enlightenment, which was arguably one of the best transcend enablers and payoffs in the deck. If you had 1 blue, you only got 1 mode off of levels, typically Go Again or Draw a Card. However, with 2 blues, you get 2 modes, most often Draw a Card and Go Again. At 3 blues, however, this card gets absolutely insane. You get a 1 cost, 5 attack, Go Again, and Draw a Card. An important thing to remember about this card is that you did have to cut it into new just so that you didn't have the risk of her being able to play it out of banish and get a bunch of free damage on you. However, in basically every other matchup, this card was insane. The final example of card advantage I want to talk about is Ancestral Harmony. I think there's a big asterisk here on card advantage. Really what this card was the ultimate gambling simulator. This card encouraged you to include more combo cards in deck building to have a higher chance to get free cards off the top. During the Art of War days, I generally thought of this as roughly half an Art of War, not quite the exact same power level as Art of War, but it did have a lot of high roll potential. And later on, this became a bit more fair. Generally, it was a +1 or +2 Transcendent starter that blocked 3, had Go Again, and cost 0. And occasionally, it still won you the game. In the last 2 sections, we talked about the standout cards that made Zen work and made him incredibly powerful. However, for the next 2 sections, I want to discuss the other cards that were included in Zen deck building. Filler cards are any cards that you need to make the deck work, but are not really powerful cards in and of themselves. These cards are most often changed between different variations of Zen lists due to meta changes, pilot preferences, and fads. We'll start by talking about the filler red cards. And I think there's 3 distinct categories that these fall into. The first category is cards that inherently have Go Again, like Spinning Wheel Kick, Harmony of the Hunt, and Tiger Form Incantation. The second category is conditional Go Again cards, so cards like Pouncing Key, Breed Anger, E-Strike, cards that sometimes have Go Again, sometimes don't. And the final category is cards without Go Again, or cards I like to call Chain Enders, because you end the combat chain with them. To piggyback off the reds, let's also discuss filler blues, which I think are a bit more interesting. For Zen, there are 4 main factors that made a blue worth including in deck building. These factors are having 3 block, having Go Again unconditionally, being a 0 cost, and being an attack action as opposed to a non-attack action, since we have 3 targeted Transcend cards that require an attack to Transcend. There's no one card in particular that had everything, however, if you meet 3 out of the 4 of these requirements, the card was pretty solid. There are too many blues to discuss in this documentary, but my favorite blues were Wind Chakra, Biting Breeze, and also Shifting Winds of the Mystic Beast, which was one of my favorite cards of all time. With that, I've attempted to highlight the main cards I saw in Zen over the past year. While there are other spicy cards in Zen, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds of every niche piece of tech. If I mentioned every spicy card I've seen in Zen over the past year, we'd probably be here for another few hours. I picked out some of my favorites here just to showcase some of the variety in Zen deck building, which I think was one of the most fun and expressive parts about the hero. This section was mainly to build a foundation for people unfamiliar with Zen, so that folks don't get too lost. In the next part of the Zen documentary, we'll get into the real history of Zen and how he evolved over his tenure in Classic Constructed. Hey everyone, hope you all enjoyed part 1 of the Zen documentary. When Teague and I first started writing the script and laying the groundwork for this documentary, we originally intended to have the full video out by August 1st, and the initial vision for this project was a much more simple send-off for one of our favorite heroes mixed in with a few guest interviews. The vision for this project has grown a bit in scope due to inspiration from other creators like Ristic Studies and Summoning Salt, and we wanted to create something much more like a full-length feature film to highlight a pivotal period in Flesh and Blood's history as a TCG. While the increase in scope is cool because we get to make a much more in-depth and detailed video, it will require more time to get completely right. The guest interviews, script, and storyboard are all, for the most part, done. However, just recording the narration and editing everything together on the timeline for this part alone has taken us 2 months of effort. Our goal is to wrap up the documentary in 2 more parts, with the end goal to finish by the end of this year. We wanted to give a special thank you to our guest interviewees, folks who gave us feedback, and our subscribers and Patreon supporters. We appreciate your patience in waiting for future parts, and we promise it will be worth the wait.